Aisha.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Aisha Sarwari, very honored to be talking to these wonderful authors. Just a couple of housekeeping rules before we start. If we could please not have multiple conversations. You're here to listen to these wonderful people, so let's give them our attention. Secondly, if we can also turn our phones on silent and not vibrate so that there's no disturbance in the middle of the conversation. And lastly, if whoever's at the door can just make sure that that level of commotion stays down. You're not a stranger to these wonderful people, Aroosa, Taha, Muneeza. I wanted to start with you, ma'am. When we were having this pre-conversation for this session, you said something very interesting. I was like, who's your favorite author? And you said, you know, all the people in my family. I love that kind of confidence and also that integration in the sense that what your family has written, and particularly the women in your family have written, makes sense to you and that you own it. Please tell us a little about that.
About my family, the women in my family. Well, there are actually quite a lot. The immediate women in my family, I suppose, is my daughter, myself, my two daughters, myself and my mother, by the way, have all been published by Oxford University Press. My mother, who's actually not the first, but she wrote had her first book published when she was 84. She wrote her memoirs when my father was ill, and her sister said, you've had a good life, you write about it. And she just wrote it, and you know, to be distributed to friends and family. And then she gave it to Amina Sayyed and said, Beta, tum bhi pad lo. And Amina had it published. And my mother was just so excited, and it was such an exciting thing for her. Because she had, she's very literary, but in our family, my father's language was English, and so was that of my sister and me. My mother's language was Urdu, and she was steeped in Urdu. And she wrote a very classical Urdu. She comes from a very literary family. And her book is full of poems and classical Urdu, and it was also translated. But actually, in my family, it's a much older story. My mother's aunt, my grandmother's first cousin, was the Indian novelist Hamida Sultan Begum, who wrote a book called Rang Mahal, among other things about our family. Women in our family in Delhi in the 1920s and 30s, and to me it always seems to be an Urdu answer to Ahmad Ali's Twilight in Delhi. This is my own personal comment. My dadi, my grandmother, Inam Fatima Habibullah, who was actually an activist, she actually, no one remembers it because she didn't migrate, but she actually proposed the women's wing of the Muslim League in 1938 at the Patna conference. And she was very active. She was elected into the parliament. But before that, in 1924, she went with my grandfather and her little daughter, who became the activist Tazeen Faridi. She went with him to England to visit her three sons, who was at boarding school. And she's written an entire travelogue, Tasirat-e-Safar-e Europe. And so I had all these relatives who were writing, and they were all women. And then later I found others who wrote autobiographies. There was Hamida Sultan Begum. Hamida Sultan was the first woman ophthalmologist in undivided India. And so it sort of carries on. And so when Aisha asked me, what are your favorite books? I said my answer is completely nepotistic. My favorite books are those written by my relatives.
I am a bit shocked that someone can publish a memoir at post-80 age. So hopefully if your moms are there, they're healthy, please ask them to write, because I think this is the era of women coming out and talking about generational trauma, their perspectives on what they endured. There's so many stories in there, so please go home, tell your moms to write that memoir. And Allah na kare, they're not there, please write on their behalf what they endured. I think it is time for us to bring those voices to the forefront. Aroosa, before I come to you, I want to ask a follow-up question to Muneeza ji. मुनीज़ा जी, आपने जब बात कर रहे थे, देखें आपने उर्दू के बारे में भी बात की, right? Do you think English, Muneeza ji, is an elitist language? We spoke a little about that as well. कि जब पाकिस्तानी बैठ के डिसाइड करते हैं कि अब हमें दुनिया के लिटरेचर के स्टेज के ऊपर आना है तो हम अंग्रेज़ी का इस्तेमाल करते हैं, आज का पैनल भी इसी मौजू पे है. What do you think about the fact that us authors are now a minority, a global minority within a bigger minority, and what role does English play in that?
Is that for me?
That's for you, yes.
Well, English is actually quite a complicated story. You have to face the fact that you have English medium schools, and children who learn in English medium schools often become more familiar with English than Urdu. It is the natural language. To use a personal anecdote, I do have, or did have a friend, she's no longer around, who had been, traveled abroad, she'd been to Cambridge, and her mother and father, and they always believed, there was this great dialogue I grew up with, by the way, that Desi should not write in English because, you know, they don't know how to get it right, and it's not our language. But it's all right for them to write non-fiction because they must promote our languages. And you must write in Urdu if you want to write creatively. The result was my friend, whose first language was English, didn't write anything at all. You know, she just couldn't express herself. I don't know if Haris is here. Haris will tell you he writes in Punjabi, Urdu, and English. He will tell you what different languages, when people are multilingual, which I am not, offer you different languages. When you talk about elitism, well, are you trying to say that people who are born into a certain class and don't have any experiences to relate? Because even if you're born into the elite in Pakistan or India and elsewhere, you're still not part of the elite in England. You're still part of a marginalized minority, even though things have changed since my childhood. In England, you've got a huge migration from Pakistan and India. They are not elite people often. Some of them, incidentally, like Hanif Qureshi, for example, who came from an elite Indo-Pakistani family, nevertheless grew up about working class Britain, because that's what he grew up in, that was his mother's life. And again, there's a disconnect, because elite people, because we are privileged, the one who's written English, we don't accept what Hanif writes, because we said, oh, he's just pandering to the English, but that was the working class world that he grew up in. And the other sort of contradiction is that the British academics who criticize, who write books on Hanif, they, because he's asserting his Britishness all the time, they deny or will not look at his Pakistani heritage. And he came from this wonderful family of writers, and he engages with them in his writing. So it's a very complex situation. And then you have a lot of working class people, who grew up in Britain. One of the things that I had mentioned to Aisha earlier was I'm always very perplexed that Abdullah Hussein's a wonderful Urdu writer. He lived in England for about 40 years. He wrote wonderful books in Urdu. And he wrote one short story. I think it's called Wapsi Ka Safar, I'm not sure, but it became a British TV series called Brothers-in-Law. And then he developed it into a novel called Emigre Journeys, which is about illegal immigrants in Britain. But I never get anyone, hardly anyone ever mentions Abdullah Hussein's English novel. And I'm really perplexed. I mean, when they write about his history and his contribution. So we have this kind of odd, uneasy relationship with English. And the other thing that's also happening in world literature in English, it's being called world literature in English now, is they are now looking not just at Anglophone writing, but they're actually also looking at translations. And we have, for example, Intizar Hussain, who was shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize.
Jay.
So there's much happening.
No, thank you for highlighting that. I think we forget that there is an entire migrant population that lives within two worlds, the English, the Urdu, and the local languages like Punjabi or Sindhi. And taking that to the world, I think is easier now because the world allows for more translations. Taha wrote this wonderful piece, and you should read it, about how the Nobel Prize and its own politics is now shifting towards very, very different languages to honor the experiences of people within those languages. You should definitely check it out. Aroosa, I want to come to you. You've written extensively about trends, right? About how after 9/11 the Muslim world was looked at and how our literature specifically was perceived. So it seems as though this entire panel is based on the book that you wrote. Can you talk to us about what those trends are in summary, for those of us who don't understand literature from a very structural perspective? And also, how has the pandemic helped or maybe challenged that trend? And basically, do authors like in Pakistan have it better off or worse off now?
Thank you so much, Aisha. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. You know, literature, I believe, is, you know, it basically gives us an insight into people's life, I mean, imagined or real, through the process of world making, or what we call alternative cognitive avenues. I mean, just look at the way in the last 4 to 5 years, we all have been struggling or grappling with, you know, the COVID-induced traumas, emotional traumas, mental health issues. And we have been actually struggling to sort of cope with our disillusionment and anxiety and alienation. Now, and this alienation was kind of paradoxical in nature for me. Why paradoxical? Because on the one hand, we were actually practicing social distancing. And on the other hand, we were actually connected with each other through various platforms and social media and apps. So this long distant relationship was painful for most of us. And so we were connected, but we were not yet connected, which actually, you know, comes to a point then, you know, what is the role of literature amidst all those emotional, social crises that we were experiencing? You know, writers basically deal with these kind of crises in their textual space. Means that textual space or text provide us with a cognitive space where worlds are created and recreated, and we talk about their contingency, we talk about, so what was happening, you know, that chaos that was happening, you know, in the last 4 or 5 years, that was actually catered to by the writers of Pakistani origin as well, whether they were based in Pakistan or they were based in the diaspora. And you must have observed one thing, that you know, after pandemic, the way literature was produced and it was consumed also changed. And you must have observed that, you know, there was a sudden emergence. I'm not saying that, you know, memoirs or life writing didn't exist. I think Muneeza's book is an excellent, you know, resource for, you know, looking into that kind of a literature, you know, since partition and before partition. But the interesting thing is that, you know, life writing, especially memoirs and the diaries, they've started to emerge. And the kind of literature that was written during pandemic and in a post-pandemic period, that was utopian and post-apocalyptic. Why? Because this kind of literature actually helped us to look at or to contemplate the miseries or the vulnerability of the human life. And this actually, you know, reminds me of, I really would like to mention that this kind of a literature was actually called by Clay Chambers as infection fiction or decolonial writing. Now, and then, you know, Margaret Atwood has come up with another very interesting term, ostopia, which is kind of a blend of dystopia and utopia. Now, why? Because this kind of literature actually explicates the idea of togetherness. It means that when I said that, you know, that partly we were connected and partly we were not connected, so during pandemic, because of this increased digitization, what happened was that, you know, the line between our personal and the social life blurred. And then, in addition to talking about our existential dilemmas and our personal miseries and emotional crises, we started contemplating the future of humanity. And that's precisely what is dealt by the writers in their fiction. As I said, that in that cognitive space, writers create and recreate the world, and not only recreate the world, but they also come to the point that how to negotiate, you know, these crises and what is to be done for the future as well. So we come to this futuristic world as well. Now, as far as the trends in literature is concerned, intriguingly, I think Pakistani Anglophone literature is is in a state of development, and it's constantly evolving and expanding. I mean, you just talk about the writers of, Kamila Shamsie, Uzma Aslam Khan, Taha, Usman T. Malik, Osama Siddiq, Jabin Saveri. I mean, there's so many writers. I mean, I think it wouldn't be fair to just name a few and then leave others, but there's so many writers who are actually engaging with debates which are both local and global. Like, we're talking about our local, very indigenous issues, whether they're related to patriarchy or religious extremism or, marginalization of the minority. But we're also talking about human rights. We're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about robotics and cyborgs. So, I think that, the way we are experimenting with the other, and then, eco-criticism, we're talking about environmental rights and crisis. So I think there's a lot that is to be done, but that has already been done by Pakistani writers. So yes, it is constantly evolving, and we are actually trying to position ourselves in the midst of the global imaginary.
Thanks, Aroosa, and I really appreciate you quoting Margaret Atwood. She's my all-time favorite author. And one of my favorite quotes of her is that a word after a word after a word is power. I think we forget that perhaps in this place where we're talking about missiles and wardom, the power of words transcends a few angry men that go to war. It stays there. It stays in the libraries. It stays in the shelves. Taha, I want to come to you and ask you, Aroosa has really brought forth the trends, right? All the way from the diary writing of the pandemic to migrant culture. Basically, somebody is taking an experience and they're talking about how they transformed. I could have asked her this question because it relates to gender, but in your book, typically, Tanya, you have taken a bit of a migrant position of somebody who's observed the life of a woman, who's not typical, and done such a fantastic job in bringing it forward through this concept of romance or love. But it's much deeper than that. So I would like you to take this question about, isn't the gender divide that we see in Pakistan, where, if I may remind you, only 20% are part of the formal economy, only 1% own any capital, 9 out of 10 women are beaten in their homes either by a significant other or their family. How did you get to observe so astutely the role of women, the lives of women?
Well, it's purely based on observation, no doubt, but fundamentally, you mentioned romance. I think that book is an anti-romance. On the contrary, I think it's more of Tanya's romance with the city, romance with her surroundings, romance in terms of friendship alone, and it's rooted in patriarchy. My challenge when I was producing that book was, of course, getting into the mind of this character, and it was a challenge, no doubt. I wouldn't say it was easy to get that voice right. Now, 5 years later, I mean, it's been that long, I think when you talk about patriarchy, it surrounds us in every way. It's something that is seeded into the system. It's something that we often don't even see. It's invisible, but it's prevalent. And it's difficult to observe these nuances and actually figure out that this is something that is a patriarchal expectation and we have to counter it in some way. So just the first person narrative voice was more interesting for me because I was able to unlock a lot more and observe a lot more just through that lens and through that voice. And I had to perfect that voice as well, which was another challenge. So I think it was through the process of writing that book, the way her insights fell onto the page and became a reality, at least for me. That's how I actually was able to dissect exactly what her challenges were. And realistically, it was meant to be an anti-romance. So even if anybody says it was through the lens of love, I now disagree with it because it was more a lesson in empathy and compassion and also a lesson in recognizing what those challenges are. So, yeah.
I like the fact that in the book, there's a bit of a runaway groom as opposed to a runaway bride, right?
Yeah.
In what ways do you think your life you know, authors try to fix things. In some ways, we're all trying to do sense making, like Aroosa said, or as Muneeza ji said. We're trying to make sense of the chaos. What were you trying to fix or make sense of?
Oddly enough, I don't see writing as a problem-solving exercise. I just see it as an opportunity to understand the human experience. I'm interested in social justice, but I don't like to pursue it while I'm writing. I'm curious about how people interact with one another, because we are different people. We are three-dimensional. That's what makes us fundamentally human. And that's what I want to explore through writing. I want to understand different characters. So with typically Tanya, it was a first-person narrative perspective that completely excluded the voices of other characters. With my new novel, which was just released, I have completely, taken away that first-person narrative voice and allowed the other characters to have a say about a particular protagonist. So for me, it was never really about something I wanted to resolve. I've always been interested in exploring what the issue is and why it exists, as opposed to leaving it there. Because see, we can't, as fiction writers, focus on solving problems. That's not our domain. I think and it's also not necessary for us to depict something in a positive way. I do agree that there has to be some ethicality when we're writing, because that's the requirement of the day, and it's also sensible. But I don't think you can resolve anything through fiction. You can depict it. You can allow people to understand it better, because that's fundamentally what you do. You're humanizing people, experiences. You're making them, and the reality of fiction is that I may write about something that I've experienced. The reader may not have been through that. And I do believe that a book reveals itself to you as a reader. Yeah. You may not like something at a particular point in your life, but you may go through an experience that helps you navigate some, situation that you're facing.
Which leads me to the question that you found a lot of success in your writing work, at least for somebody who kind of joined a little later. You haven't been always writing. You got into it semi-recently, and it's really been well received. How does that feel? Like, how do people respond to your success? Like, are they like, oh, I didn't know Pakistani's new English type
I don't
commentary?
think I've had any success, frankly speaking. I don't think
That's not what Google says, but humble of you to feel that. But
no, I don't know if, I don't think it's really success. I think it's more of a contribution to literature. That's what I always want to see work as. I'd like to build on what exists, because there are better writers, worthier writers, and I'm more interested in different writers and their voices. So when you asked her about her favorite writer, I would say everybody. I've read her book, Hybrid Tapestries, from start to finish, and I still refer to it.
Thank you.
For a lot of work.
Thank you.
So there's a lot to be gained from different voices. So it's very easy to say कि ये मैं हूँ, ये मेरा fun है, and that's it. But that doesn't work like that. You have to learn from each other.
मुनीज़ा जी, आपकी क्योंकि बुक की तारीफ़ भी हुई है, और ताहा ने ये भी बताया कि we don't necessarily need to do art to fix anything. We need to do art for the sake of doing art, right? We need to indulge in it because it's a pursuit, and productivity की इतनी कोई ख़ास ज़रूरत नहीं है कि आप जाके जो है ना दुनिया ठीक करें. आप आर्ट कैसे अप्रोच करती हैं? और आपके लिए, जैसे ताहा के लिए आपकी किताब ज़रूरी थी. Who were the people who made you put pen to paper?
What made me put pen to paper? That's a bit of a long story. Why I put pen to paper? When I was growing up, by the way, I wanted to be a scientist. And then I was told that there were no scientists in Pakistan, women for scientists in Pakistan. I get a great kick out of young Pakistani women who become dean of Harvard and all this, and scientists. But
we're not particularly good to the men scientists as well in this country.
Yes, but I was told anyway, it was a hopeless career, and I never thought of writing as a career because, people wrote. I just thought it was something people did because of all my grandmother and whatnot. So what actually started me off was the fact that I grew up in England. I was a child, I was at school there from 9 to 18. There was absolutely nothing about my country in the books. I loved reading. Ever since I was a little tot, I loved reading, I loved books. But in England, there was the Jungle Book, okay. And then there was Passage to India. But what the hell did anything have to do with my life, with my family? I mean, there was nothing. I was aware that there was such a thing as Desi's right in English because I had an aunt. My chachi was a novelist, Atiya Hussain. But nobody at my school ever heard about it. When her novel, Sunlight on a Broken Column, came out, which is considered a classic today, I was so excited. And I remember saying I mentioned this to you, that my English teacher turned around to me and she said, "Oh, what is this novel that you and your sister keep talking about? I've never heard of it." That was the end of that story. Then I come back to Pakistan and have to adjust to a country I didn't know too well. So then I start reading Ahmad Ali, and then I start falling in with all these poets like Salman Qureshi, Adrian Hussein. They were all my friends, and they were writing poetry, and they were writing poetry that was not available to me in England. And suddenly I realized there was this entire body of work. So I get more and more involved in this. Then eventually which is another long story, but I eventually go into journalism. I had the good fortune to have a very good editor, Mr. Muhammad Ali Siddiqui. He discovered I liked reading and literature. He started me, he said, "Oh, Hanif, there's a chap called Hanif Qureshi here, go and interview him. There's Falana, this." So I was suddenly interviewing all these writers, and because of this experience of England and coming and being in Pakistan, I was able to combine these two influences. And my first anthology was the result of, well, that was by OUP, they asked me to do it, but I had by this time been interviewing and writing about a lot of Pakistani English writers, and that eventually, all these anthologies and this writing, that's what led to my book, Hybrid Tapestries, A Development of Pakistani Literature. And the word hybrid tapestries, because there's a duality here. It's an English literature which draws on the Pakistani experience. And actually, if you go back into history, you find how literature travels. You know, the Panchatantra has influenced the Khalila Dinna, that influenced the Aesop's fables, the stories of La Fontaine. Then you get the reverse coming back. You had Andalusia. In Andalusia, they used to, with the Arab culture, they used to have ghazals, they have to have qasidas, and then you have that traveling back, and now you've got people like Shadab Hashmi, the late Agha Shahid Ali, who are writing and promoting the ghazals in English, trying to revert this form into the English language. Shadab writes qasidas. Then we've expanded the, I find it terribly exciting. Atar Tahir has written an entire book in haiku. He's looked to the Orient. So it carries on. And this is what really led to my book and my engagement in this form in my writing. I'm just fascinated by literature because the other thing I love about literature is it looks at the grades. If there's a war, if there's a battle, if someone's having a jhagra, the literature will tell you something, a story in between. And a lot of our stories are actually stories in between.
Thank you, Muneeza ji. And just because you might have inadvertently missed out, it was never easy for Pakistani authors to publish. I think when Bapsi Sidwa first started looking at her work, it wasn't like, oh, she's written it and now everybody's loving to publish it. There was always this gap between the writer's world and the publisher's world. And I'll go to Aroosa for this, yes, to answer this question, because academia, work, and literature interact. And we've talked about the past. So we've talked about how these ancient texts were converted into first Urdu, then English, and it became a very Pakistani experience. I just want to tell the audience we'll take maybe a couple of questions, so keep them in mind. Aroosa, to you, when you're teaching young people, do you see that this kind of legacy can be celebrated? Are there young men and women, say Gen Zs, who are interested in going into literature, publishing? And if they do, how are they going to make money, for instance? It's considered that people who write or don't need to work. So bridge that gap for me. If anyone in this room or anyone listening is young and wants to write and take this forward, how do they survive? How do they eat?
I think this is a question that I think ought to be answered by some publishers, Because yes, I mean, we were just talking outside and we were pointing out the same thing that, there are a lot of young writers who are actually writing, but they do not find appropriate platform. And especially I'm talking about the young writers who haven't published before. So how are they going to find a market or even a publisher for their work? Yes, there are some online, places, platforms where you can just get your work published. But with the passage of time, I think, with the increasing popularity of Pakistani Anglophone writing, because Pakistani literature courses are now being taught across the globe. And I know that in the University of Texas and University of Toronto and many UK universities, UK universities are actually offering the courses on Pakistani Anglophone writing. So with this increasing popularity, yes, I think there are more now chances to get published. I mean, you can find, there are a lot of young people who have now started these publishing houses as well. And the aim is to sort of give chance to those who are not really very popular. But yes, there was a time when probably, Uzma Aslam Khan's first book was published in India and not in the UK or elsewhere.
Omar, welcome. I hope it was Islamabad's terrible traffic that kept you away from us.
It did. My apologies.
We don't believe that because Islamabad is not Karachi or...
I actually was coming down from Murray. So
okay.
it's really the Murray traffic.
Bilkul theek hai. Umar, thank you for joining us. Main Taha ko batayi thi, he's been pretty successful with some of his work and he was denying it. Aap nahi deny kar sakte, aapki kitab, Teesri Wali, is becoming a TV show. And I think that really allows Pakistani literature to transcend a mass media because everybody is, stuck to platforms like Netflix and stuff. Do you think we've arrived as a people into mainstreaming our stories through your work?
I don't know. I think the question of whether we've arrived or not, I'm not sure about, because I think the way that these things work is that one piece of literature kind of goes from one medium into another, and either it catches fire or it doesn't catch fire. So everyone says that, that is the seminal moment ki ji ye, this caught fire and it's sort of we've arrived and we've mainstreamed ourselves. So I guess the sort of proof of that will come in if that happens. But to answer the question of whether novels, Pakistani novels should move from one medium into another, why not? I think as with anything else, good stories are good stories wherever and whatever medium they're in.
Muneeza ji abhi earlier baat kahi thi Hanif Qureshi ke bare mein. These are authors that have transcended platform. Like, they're people who even when they're sick sit down and write Twitter stories about their health. So this cross-platform conversation is happening. But for our stories to be accepted by the masses, there has to be a certain universality of the theme. और आपकी themes में I wanted to ask कि जिससे भी आपका काम पड़ा है, it has to do a lot with crime, darkness, और आपकी Wall Street Journal का review basically said, the book Prisoner is so dark that the reader will come out terrified. So let's explore that. Like, is Pakistan an easy place to write about how to terrorize readers?
I think that as with all the authors on this panel, they'll tell you that you write what you know, right? Incidentally, I seem to know a lot about dark things, so I tend to write about what you would call darker subjects. But you could find those stories equally anywhere in the world, right? If you look at the Prisoner, it's a story about crime and sort of various motifs that come in that. And really, I think you can probably write a similar story about Colombia or Mexico or New York or any such place where you have those similar dynamics.
I've always wanted to ask you this when I was reading The Prisoner. You know, Jeffrey Dahmer ke upar, there was this entire Netflix series of this serial killer, but we have one that's better, unfortunately. ये जो Javed Iqbal वाला incident था. I think, is there a reason why you can do dark, but you cannot do death and such extreme horror that, you know, existed in the realm of mental health? How far do you think universal themes like dark crime or pain or suffering or the lack of infrastructure or corruption within the police system can become a good story versus it becoming too much?
Hopefully you're asking my opinion, not as a serial killer, but as a writer.
Yeah, hopefully.
As a writer, it's interesting that you should ask that. The next book that I'm now starting research on, I haven't started writing it, is incidentally based on the serial killer in Lahore, Javed Iqbal, or based loosely on him. So, you know, again, I'll find out if people show up and buy the book. It means that yes, you can write about stuff as dark as you like, and if they don't buy the book, then, you know, I'll accept your point.
But it's interesting that I thought this question while reading The Prisoner.
You must be bugging my phones.
Yeah, probably. Because I was reading it and I was like, why aren't you writing about that? Because this kind of dissection of crime that you do in your work, it would really make a lot of sense about how twisted minds work, right? And it makes for good literature.
It's books like that, or because you have to, as a writer, really, if you want to get it right, you have to really kind of put a part of your soul into it, and it's very heavy. And I got, you know, a taste of it when I wrote The Spinner's Tale, because that was perhaps one of the darker books that I've written. And so I think one of the reasons why you would tend to hold back or not go to that as a first option is that probably it's very taxing. It would take a lot out of you. I haven't started, I'm just sort of starting the research, but I would assume that it would take a lot out of you.
I know, because I'm bugging your phone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Acha, we'll take a couple of questions. I don't know if there's a handheld mic anywhere. Please keep your questions very brief and in one sentence. Do not make commentary. But these are wonderful authors who've taken the Pakistani experience, the human experience, to a global world. I'm pretty sure you're curious about how they did it. Any questions? Wait for the mic, please. अपना नाम बताइएगा और एक sentence का सवाल.
This is Muhammad Farooq from University of Haripur. My question is that on a close reading of Pakistani literature in English, it seems that it is becoming more politicized and it is losing the element of literariness and aestheticism. So how you respond to this question?
Good question. Hero, villain, victim होता है, love stories होती हैं, और अब थोड़ा ज़्यादा political हो गया है. Muneeza ji, would you like to respond first?
Well, I mean, I never thought of it as anything. I mean, as political, I think the politics were always very strong one way or the other in it. If you take the earliest novel, it is pre-partition, it was Ahmed's Twilight in Delhi. It's very political. It's a clear criticism of the Raj, of the British rule, of a whole lot of things, of the gestation from what is English and with a tradition. I mean, these are all political issues. Politics is not just, X, Y, Z versus X, Y, Z. It is about what you believe. Politics is about education. Politics is about family. Politics is about a whole lot of things. And these are issues that are political issues in proper countries. Over here, it's just about if you like X and if you like X, Y. So I don't actually see that as a development, or I don't particularly see that as happening. I mean, I just don't see it. To me, it's always been political one way or the other.
I don't think one can write without politics, because politics is all about power. Somebody wants something and the other person doesn't want to give it to you.
That's politics. Feminism is politics.
Yeah. Taha?
I think all fiction is political. If you take a very narrow definition of politics, you'd say it's about, what's happening in the power corridors. But even a love story has political elements, because if you think about it, we as people are influenced by the world around us. So it's inescapable in so many ways.
Yeah, and often the power flows in one direction. Right?
And that
And
is
then
the
somebody,
reality.
typically not Tanya,
I
will
think
fight it.
there's certain novels that are very cathartic. Like, if you see, there are some books about politics that deal with, you know, some form of social justice, and those are cathartic books. But I don't think Pakistani fiction is any poorer with the political element in it. I think it's very strong, very meaningful.
Being an academic scholar, I think anyone who is a voracious reader of Pakistani Anglophone literature would say that, you know, there is so much diversity. Look at the works of the Pakistani writers. I mean, look at the genres line, you know, writing about utopian, dystopian themes. There's a fantasy, there is a myth, there's a folklore, and there is a, you know, hardcore science fiction as well. And then they're even experimenting with the genres in a beautiful way, mixing the myth and the sci-fi. I mean, read Usman T. Malik, read Abina Shah, read Sami Shah, Sabine Javeri. I mean, all these writers have actually experimented with the ideas in a beautiful way. And I mean, the range of topics is phenomenal. So I think it would be just to sort of label it as a single monolithic category dealing with just politics, or, you know, or you can't say that it is stagnating. It's constantly evolving. And the boom of Pakistani writings across the globe is in itself a proof of the fact that how diverse our writers are.
Omar?
Yeah, I've never understood when people say literature is literature, it's about good stories. As Taha said, they will have political content overtly or implicitly. So I don't quite get that premise that literature has to be literary. Literature is literature.
I think maybe the concern is कि जब आप literature को किसी political backdrop में डालें, तो अगर आपके reader के preferences हों, तो in the sense that, you know,
not really to offend, but it's good to hear another point of view.
Yeah, that's the primary objective of literature, to create empathy.
But it's not about the politics. I would never support writing that advocates complete or extreme, you know, political
partisanism.
I would prefer if there is a balance. Like Muneeza mentioned this earlier, that when you're looking at history, you'll find one particular narrative, but with fiction, you'll be told a story from different points of view.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it political. Like, even partition literature is very political.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about perspectives, alternative perspectives. So literature basically intervenes in readers' understanding of one peculiar idea. Like as Taha just mentioned, partition, like the text that was written by Bapsi Sid, Vice Candyman, is totally different from the text which was written by, Abdullah Hussain. I mean, there is no even ideological leaning in that particular text. You can't say it's a pro-Pakistan or it's anti-Pakistan. So it remains an ambiguity. So much is left on the imagination of the reader to interpret the text that way. So it's all about diversity and alternative perspectives.
And like you said, point of view. तो अगर किसी Parsi community ने India-Pakistan के partition के बारे में लिखा है, it's going to be very different from the whole religious perspective. I hope you got your answer. Okay, great. This young lady, can we please give her a mic? Okay, she has one.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Marina Aziz Khan. I'd like to know what the panel thinks is the future of contemporary Pakistani literature, given the challenges we have right now of declining reading culture. We don't have a library culture, our bookstores are dying, and generally, and as you guys mentioned, that publishing is a nightmare. So in light of all these challenges that we have, where is Pakistani literature headed, and what can be done about it institutionally?
Thank you for that wonderful question. Omar, can I start with you?
That's a very pertinent point, and obviously we face an uphill struggle. But you know, I found, for instance, that in recent times, something that seems to circumvent all of the challenges that have been pointed out by the young lady is innovative ways around it. So understandably, it's difficult. We don't have a library culture. Reading is declining. But I find, for instance, personally, I started reading a lot more audible books. And I felt that it's a way, you know, you're doing something and you have your Audible books on, and I think that's a space where perhaps we haven't been innovative enough. I think that can be a way for not just Pakistani literature in English, but also in Urdu, to get it to a wider audience, to make it a lot more relatable, and to retain the people who are kind of walking out on reading books, you know, which is our great fear.
But that's from the input side, as in what readers can do to enrich their lives. Maybe Aroosa, you can talk about the output or the supply side of it. How do you create content that can find a universe out there?
I think I've always maintained this, that irrespective of the medium, whether it's film, you know, the written word, poetry, a good story will always have resonance, right? And it's and irrespective of all the other sort of things that are there to capture people's attention, it's a matter of maintaining or increasing the quality of the storytelling.
So if the story is great, it will find a place.
It will find a
Yeah.
place. Yeah.
Aroosa, your point?
And one more thing that, you know, again, if you just talk about, you know, the emerging genre of speculative literature, I mean, no matter whatever the subgenres are, intriguingly, you know, the writers are writing, because, you know, we're talking about the things which globally readers are interested in. As I said, that, you know, you talk about artificial intelligence, you talk about the information technology, you talk about human rights debates, the things related to racism and how artificial intelligence will induce racism. So these are all the experimental ideas which our local writers are writing, but in their own way. And here I would really like to mention one really good thing. I don't know if the writers are doing it. We have to, you know, creative writers here, but I don't think that you're doing it consciously. It can be an unconscious act, but there is a process of decolonization, decoloniality, where they're approaching the thing from a non-West-centric perspective, which means that we are situating ourselves within the global imaginary, means that we are giving our perspective. And I think the readers, wider readers, like across the globe, they're interested to hear what our stories are. And at the same time, these stories, they are actually catering to their taste as well. So people are writing about science. People, for example, you know, there were many texts have come out that were simply about pandemic or virus. So people are writing about that. How to deal with that? People are interested, you know, in knowing that. And then where do we position ourselves vis-a-vis, you know, the sci-fi, you know, themes? But interestingly, we are coming up with our own ideas and our stories, and this is something which make them interesting for the wider reader.
Thank you. I really like the decolonization part. Basically, write about your own experience, you know, the very, very local experience, and it will become universal. Taha?
If you think about it, there are new genres that are being explored in Pakistani literature, and there is an audience for that. There was a time when it was exclusively literary. I loved that, but many people felt that, you know, there's a lot more that could be done. So people I would love to read a Pakistani horror novel. That hasn't appeared.
I think Omar's writing one.
Omar's writing one, right. I'll have to read that. But I think with time, something has to be done to resuscitate reading habits, literature in some way. A filmmaker will easily get feedback on his or her work because people will go to a cinema and watch a film. But with a book, you know, it's not the same level of engagement. It's not just happening right in front of you.
It might be a good thing if authors were getting instant feedback, like in the Instagram reels, they probably would stop writing. And the beauty about writing is it's solitary. It's quiet,
solitary,
it's
and
distanced.
even the reading process is solitary.
Yeah.
So even though people will say, okay, no, your book is not really getting that kind of traction, there are readers who will keep that experience to themselves. They will never want to voice that feeling or judgment, not because they don't like it, but because it was very personal and very intimate. So I think, as Omar very rightly pointed out, that we could explore audiobooks, we could explore other mediums of getting our work out there. But there is a lot of good work happening these
Yeah.
days. So yeah.
It's not about, like, yes, I know that there are many bookstores across the globe that are shutting down, which is such a shame. But people have found other ways to read as well. I mean, you have Kindle and you have ebooks now
You have
available.
Spotify,
So I think
you
that
have podcasts.
yes. So during pandemic and even after pandemic, I don't think that the people have stopped reading. They're reading, but they're reading diverse stuff. And
Yeah.
of course, the ebooks have made it so easy for them. And then one very important thing, that the platforms like literature festivals, I think that has played, these have played a really important role in inculcating a reading culture.
Yeah, it's
you
the
know.
only time that, like
Yeah.
goths, like the authors come
And
out.
also the way we gauge success in a literary sense has to change
Has
as
to
well.
change.
It's not really
Yeah.
just about how many books you sell and how well you've been reviewed.
Yeah.
Maybe
Change the concept of success overall.
success
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
Muneeza ji, we end with yours.
Well, I've actually, we do have a problem. We do need more libraries. I don't know why we don't have them. It's a perfectly straightforward thing. But there are various changes that have happened, partly also because of the internet and partly not. One of the things that has happened is that you've got literary pages in the newspapers, which you never used to have. You've got books and authors, you've got literati, they're all discussing books, so they're telling you about. One of the problems with readers is that you want to have an idea of a review, you haven't had an idea of a book, more than just thumbing through it. And when you have literary reviews, you can access them. You've now got internet sites, which will also have literary reviews, so you know what the books are about. I have seen this change in a book club to which I belonged for, ran for many years. In the early days, the books were simply not, the books we wanted to read were not available locally. I found that with the advent of the internet, there was a much wider dissemination of knowledge about books, and our bookstores started getting those books. These days, the crisis is the prices, because everything has gone up, and because of our battle with next door India, we can't get books from there. Those are political issues. So the other thing is, it's not just literature about reading. I know we do go on about it, and I know people don't read, and there is a problem. But audiobooks, all this is there. Not only that, we do come from a culture which has a very strong oral tradition, which, by the way, is not there in England. Although, for example, Homer's Iliad and all that was written for it was a vocal thing. It wasn't a written narrative, it was recited. We have people who are not even literate and who will know poems. They will recite fairs. They will take part in demonstrations. They will recite Habib Jalib. They know all these poems. There's a wonderful British Asian poet, and it really struck me, Zafar Kunyal. Zafar is named after Bahadur Shah Zafar, the emperor. Why? Because his father was a bricklayer, migrant bricklayer in Pakistan, and as bricklayers, when they were laying the bricks, they used to recite the poems of Bahadur Shah Zafar and his exile. Now that is something else, I've been to tailors who started reciting Zawq and Ghalib to me. You'll get Agha Shahid Ali who would write about a poem, having exchanging poems with the local butcher. Now you won't get this in England. And this is a tradition that we must really honor. And we must really develop. And it's not about reading, it's about storytelling, it's about being. I love literature because I was told stories, verbal stories. That's how I got interested in books. So you must keep up the storytelling also, and when you want your children to be interested in books, read out loud to them. Read out loud to them. Don't give them books, say you must read, it's good for you, because that'll bore them to death. And they'll say, oh. But you just make them interested. You make them interested by telling them stories.
Muneeza ji, that pretty much, I think, sums it up. I think if I was to summarize what everyone said is create your own community. Make sure there's an oral tradition where you're reading to people. Go to Substack, go to Twitter, go to any platform that resonates with you and start creating your own stories, content, in whatever way that resonates with you. And most importantly, just don't give up. just because you feel there are not enough libraries. It's easier now to get a book than it has ever been in the history of the world. There's old bookstores, there's unfortunately pirating, which is terrible, but you know, in terms of access, if you want to really know what an author says and be inspired by their ideas, you can do it. One last question from everyone and then we close. Thank you for being a fantastic audience. It's going to be one answer, so do not elaborate on it. I'm going to do the castaway thing. So you're cast away on an island and you're only allowed one book. Which book are you going to take with you? Omar, I'll start with you. It has to be one answer.
Godfather.
Okay. Aroosa?
I think I would take Uzma Aslam Khan's work, any novel.
Any novel
Yeah.
of her book. Okay. Taha?
I take The God of Small Things.
Oh, God of Small Things. Arundhati Roy. Okay.
Yeah.
Muneeza
I
ji?
take a book by my relative.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you had a fantastic time with this conversation. I hope I did justice to these wonderful people and their families. I do want to say it's been an honor speaking to everybody here. Please, the least you can do is leave here and buy their book and read their work. Thank you so much.